dangerous. You had to balance yourself properly through sleep deprivation, harsh weather, and lack of nutrition. One slip or overcorrection was enough to convert all of your potential energy into kinetic energy as you gave onlookers a direct demonstration of gravitational acceleration.
Well, there he goes.
There was at least one verifiable death directly related to the act. Granted, this was decades later in the 1970s. The unlucky fella who took the fall was 72-year-old professional polar Richard Blandy. Dear old Dick spent a record-breaking 125 days atop a pole in Stockholm, Sweden just 9 years prior, surviving mostly on whiskey and 3 packs of cigarettes a day, or as I like to call it, the stepdad special. Then things hit a wall for Richard, or in this case, the ground. In 1974, while finishing up a 4-day promotional sitting at Dixie Square Mall in Harvey, Illinois, a trailer accidentally reversed into his tower, causing it to collapse and Richard to plummet to his death. Remember, the higher the heights you reach, the longer the fall from the top. Despite the fancy-sounding name, you're probably familiar with this one. Venetian ceruse was a specific type of cosmetic concoction used throughout the 16th century in Europe. The main purpose of this product was to lighten the complexion of many a fine fella or fellette. It also served to cover up blemishes and give a refined, flawless look. Since most of my guys are drawn as white as a cheese and mayonnaise sandwich, we need to travel back in time. Believe it or not, the desire to appear pale as paste actually stretches as far back as 2000 BC with the ancient Egyptians. Well, the rich ones anyway. You see, getting all tanned and toned under the hot sun all day was a sign that you were a filthy, hard-working poor. Not wanting to look like they partook in any labor, Egyptian nobles slapped lead-based powder all over their faces to get that DoorDash enthusiast look. You know, the look of royalty. The desire for a paler complexion traveled across the Mediterranean into ancient Greek territory where, again, upper-class folks took it upon themselves to whiten their skin and cover up any skin imperfections. The trend continued on to influence ancient Rome and even ancient China, all of which stuck to the lead-based recipe. Jump into the futuristic years of the 16th century, and the beauty standard still remained, and that's about the time that Venetian ceruse entered the fray. Perhaps one of the most notable historical figures that dabbled in the dust was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The exact cause of her death is debated, but historians speculate her kicking of the royal bucket to have been a severe blood infection brought on by heavy use of her lead-based Venetian ceruse makeup. She not only used the powder to minimize any melanistic manifestations, but to cover up severe scarring from her smallpox. It also was just the fashion at the time. If you take a look at a lot of Renaissance paintings from the era, you're gonna see a lot of disturbingly white faces. It was the epitome of beauty. I mean, nowadays some people obsess over looking like dumbass balloon animals, so it's not all that outlandish. The most well-documented death directly from Venetian ceruse use was debatably beautiful babe Countess Maria Coventry. Her heavy use of the stuff caused her own skin to crack and peel, forming painful open sores that she just covered up with more makeup. She bit the dust in 1760 at the age of just 27. So what exactly was it made of and why was it so toxic? Well, first of all, it's lead. Lead's not good for you, especially not being plastered onto your skin for hours or days on end. But lead isn't even white, I hear you scream into your screen. But white lead is. This is white lead. See how white it is? Pretty freaking white. This is hydroceracite, a lead salt compound also called lead carbonate hydroxide. It's naturally occurring, usually found alongside the pure lead deposits, so some Venetian fellas in Venice decided to mine the stuff, mash it up, and mix it with water and vinegar to create a paste. It was found to have incredible drying properties, so it was actually first used in the 16th century as a medical product, being applied to icky, sticky, oozing open sores and wounds to suck up the juices. But then I guess someone got a little experimental and realized it could be a great cosmetic as well.
Would you frig me? I'd frig me.
The problem though with long-term lead exposure is that it sort of leaches through the skin and into your blood, causing lead poisoning, and any condition with the word poisoning in it naturally doesn't have pretty side effects. According to the World Health Organization, severe lead poisoning can cause a wide variety of symptoms. None of them pleasant. You have your basic nausea and vomiting, sure, but you also have crippling headaches, memory loss, the big sad, and even high blood pressure in the short term. As for the long term, we're talking reproductive issues and even permanent brain and nervous system damage. The neurological effects often led to increased aggression, hyperactivity, and the lowering of one's IQ. So in scientific conclusion, heavy lead makeup was creating a bunch of irritated, angry, infertile morons. Just like those dang
Insert political party here.
Am I right?
Granger knows that as an HVAC technician, the heat is on you every day. Your first call, and
Humans have been nodding their noggins and tapping their toes ever since first discovering a beat. And the act of rocking out usually lasts for several songs, which is normal, but how would you feel about dancing for days on end? Well, it happened. Dance marathons were all the rage back in the 1920s in the United States, but Americans actually have the British to thank for that. In February of 1923, professional dance couple Ollie and Edgar took it upon themselves to cut a British rug for 7 hours straight. This was something that, historically speaking, had never really been done before, and it caught some national attention. But in true American fashion, the British were about to be one-upped. Alma Cummings, a New York dance instructor who became fascinated with the idea of testing human limits while revolutionizing human expression, set a blistering 27-hour dance record just 12 days after the Brits tried to be good at something. I mean, look at that, she put holes in her soles for God's sake. Something was happening within the United States in the 1920s. If you recall, the flagpole sitting craze was also hitting its stride at this point in time. Americans became obsessed with record-breaking feats of human physical endurance. So publicity stunts became the norm as normal humans tried pulling off superhuman endeavors. I'm gonna lift this car. So after Alma busted her move, the idea of endurance dancing began to take off. Within the next few weeks, her record had been broken 9 times across the country, so everyone was getting into the swing of things. It became a public spectacle, with promoters hosting dancing marathons as a form of entertainment. Pay a 25-cent fee, and you could just watch people shimmy 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 to the break of dawn. Several dawns, actually. You see, it didn't take long for the craze to drop a ranked mode. Competitive dancing marathons saw couples boogieing for days on end to get a chance at solid cash prizes. Those prizes became even more valuable once the world entered the Great Depression in the 1930s. In a collapsed economy, these marathons were seen not only as a form of entertainment for the now destitute masses, but a means of survival. That's because participants were properly fed and sheltered in exchange for their performance, all while still having that chance at a grand prize. These prizes could range from a couple hundred to a couple $1,000. Now, considering that the median income in the 1930s was roughly $1,000 a year, this was a big deal, so dancing devolved from entertainment to desperation. Competitors were allowed only short breaks in between numbers to catch their breaths, but they were still required to move and groove in some form, be it a tap of the foot or a nod of the head. Couples that stayed still for too long were actually prodded with sticks or splashed with water to get them back on their feet again, lest they be disqualified and thrown to the streets. The most famous dance champions of the age were handsome stud muffin Callum de Villiers and beautiful babe Vonnie Kuczynski. So take a guess. How long do you think that their record-breaking dance lasted for? Time's up. The answer was a heel-evaporating 157 consecutive days. Over 5 months of throwing down on the dance floor. Their prize? $1,000. Almost $25,000 in today's money. To no surprise, these endurance events were not without consequence. Like I said, people fully exhausted themselves to the point of collapse. Staying in the contest meant that you had food, water, and shelter for as long as you kept shaking that thing. Unfortunately, this resulted in a few reported deaths across the nation, one of the first being 27-year-old Homer Morehouse. No, not this guy. What, you want to see an actual picture of a dude who danced himself to death? You sicken me. Just an amateur dancer, Homer had reportedly been throwing it back for 87 hours straight, suffering from malnutrition and extreme sleep deprivation. He stumbled to a chair to take a break and fell over dead. News of these deaths caused immediate nationwide banning of dance marathons when they realized that, albeit voluntary human torture, isn't all that humane. But when promoters were raking in tens of thousands of dollars per event, stacks of cold hard cash outweighed the stacks of cold hard bodies. Hold on to your piggies, cause this one's gonna cause some toes to curl. As a warning, there will be some gross feet pics somewhere in this section. Now if you'll forgive my attempt at Chinese pronunciation, we'll get right into it. The practice of foot binding, or chansu, dates all the way back to the Imperial China days, with scholars failing to fully agree on any one origin story. Some claim the practice to have existed in the 6th century, but most point towards the 10th century under the Tang dynasty. It is believed that a concubine of unsurpassed beauty was the first to bind her feet, though of course, not by choice. Lumpy Dumpling Emperor Li Yu commanded the aforementioned concubine Yao Nyang to wrap her feet in white silk to resemble the crescent moon. She then performed a fancy dance atop a golden lotus statue. The emperor stood in awe at the grace and elegance of the woman's dance, so naturally other women of status wanted to imitate it. Women would force their feet into unnatural positions, with the goal of creating what were later referred to as lotus feet. You know, like the flower, small, delicate, and beautiful. The teeny tiny tootsies were reportedly highly desirable, as Chinese men thought that this shit was undeniably sexy. Now, some historians believe that the real reason was a bit more selfish. See, this is what a real lotus foot looks like underneath the shoe. Scrumptious, right? Now imagine trying to walk around on those things all day. The reality of it was that walking on permanently disfigured feet meant excruciating pain. This resulted in women walking very daintily and slow, if at all. It has been suggested that the act of binding, while convincing women that it was to attract suitable partners, was actually a form of control, with men limiting the mobility of their wives. This would, in a sense, bind them to their homes just as their feet were bound to their shoes. This forced these women into sedentary, boring lives with nothing more to do than menial labor such as weaving and tapestry to help with the household income. Alright, but just how crunched in were them things, you may be asking yourself? And the answer is pretty friggin' crunched. Ideally, the foot was to be no longer than 4 inches or 10 centimeters in length. Ironically, the whole process was no small feat. Over the course of several months or even years, the toes would be repeatedly broken and tightly tucked under the sole, with the entire foot folded downward to achieve the desired effect. Unfortunately, it's a sad reality that innumerable Chinese women faced across the centuries. Well, no, actually, it wasn't just grown women, but young girls too. I'm talking as young as just 4 or 5 years old. Gotta fold and mold them feet while they're still growing. You ever go on the Living with the Land ride at Disney's Epcot and see the neat Mickey-shaped pumpkins growing? It's the same principle, but with human feet. The binding of youthful feet was not only practical from a physical standpoint, but a disciplinary one as well. It trained young girls to realize that life is pain, as well as the importance of abiding by societal rules and customs. This practice persisted from the 10th century all the way up to the 19th century. By then, it's estimated that nearly half of all Chinese women had their feet bound to some degree. If it wasn't obvious, all that cracking and crunching of the feet didn't exactly come with health benefits. The forced deformation commonly resulted in ulcerations, nasty sores resulting from the cracking open of skin, which were very difficult to treat properly. These led to deadly bacterial infections and gangrene, sometimes requiring the full amputation of the affected foot. Refuse to cut off one foot and you can end up 6 underground. Foot binding started to fall out of favor towards the beginning of the 20th century. By this time, mass-produced textiles began taking over, leaving the perpetually working from home women to be out of a job. So they finally put their foot down. After exhaustive women's rights campaigns, the Chinese government took a step in the right direction by formally banning binding in 1949. Now, when you've got something that's beyond repair, do you ever just make the decision to break it a bit more to give it that sense of finality? Maybe just hucking a busted light bulb into a garbage can to hear a satisfying shatter? I have a deep garbage can. Well, gosh damn it, they did the same thing to full-size locomotives back in the day. Yep, if you had yourself a free afternoon and some spare change, you could waddle your britches on down to an isolated part of the plains to witness yourself a genuine high-speed train crash. But why? Because it looked cool. Come on. You're gonna be whipping your big dumb head around to see the extent of the damage. We all do it, that's why we have traffic. But that curiosity and wonder is what drew crowds of tens of thousands of spectators throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. The premise was simple. Beginning in 1895, railroad organizers figured out a way to profit off of decommissioning their equipment. Train engines deemed obsolete either by being outdated or having otherwise unrepairable mechanical issues were placed on a long stretch of track facing each other. Onboard engineers would then set the locomotives full steam ahead before abandoning ship.
Step on the gas.
Allowing them to become a physical demonstration of physics. Spectators happily tossed a few of their hard-earned bucks to witness such a staged catastrophe. They were about as excited as a Second Amendment enthusiast experiencing his first home invasion. The problem, though, is that public safety measures at the time weren't much more than just standing back a ways while the trains did their thing. Nowadays, it's common for crowds to gather at scheduled demolition sites to watch tall buildings no longer be tall. But even at a bare minimum, safety nets are placed in front of the crowds to catch any rogue debris. Think about it, even a small stone zooming on through at hundreds of miles an hour can mean instant death. Well, that would have been a welcomed consideration in 1896. Just north of Waco, Texas, was the now infamous Crash at Crush, a staged train wreck that was more than what the crowd had bargained for. The planned crash was to occur at the town of Crush. Crash at Crush. Make sense now? The temporary town was built specifically for the event, with an expected crowd of 20,000 Texans. But thanks to effective advertising, 40,000 showed up, eagerly awaiting to see themselves a tasty train wreck. Now this should have been an omen that things weren't going to go as planned, but double the crowd meant double the doubloons and the pantaloons, so the event stuck to schedule. The two trains were put in place and sent on their way, topping out speeds at 50 miles an hour. The steam engines collided, as expected, but upon impact, the boilers violently exploded. Not as expected. The explosion launched shrapnel in every direction, which naturally included where the crowd was standing. Well, butter my buns and call me a biscuit. I don't think that was supposed to happen. You know what? I think you're right. In addition to dozens of Southern fellas sustaining some bumps and bruises from flying hunks of metal, at least 2 Texans unfortunately yeed their last haw. But surprisingly, the crowd didn't flee. Instead, they ran towards the wreckage to assess the damage and grab themselves a souvenir from the pile of twisted metal. After all, they did pay to see a wreck, so they were gonna get their money's worth. Despite the widespread report of the tragedy, the public didn't seem to care. In fact, these stunts only got more and more popular. Events kept chugging along well into the 1930s when the trend finally crashed and burned. Horrible medical cures. Yep, we're hitting hard and heavy with this one. Back in the day when you had any sorts of pains or bruises, ouches or oozes, you had the freedom to tween off screen to your local drugstore and get yourself a healthy and unrestricted dosage of opium-derived morphine slammed right down your gullet. The obvious problem with having such an addictive substance readily available is, well, people got addicted. So bad, in fact, that towards the end of the 1800s, nearly 1 in 200 people in the United States were suffering from morphine addiction, many of which were injured veterans of that uncivil Civil War that had just ended a few decades prior. The market was in demand for something less addictive while still packing a punch at minimizing pain, and that's where a certain German pharmaceutical company came into play. Bayer, or more commonly pronounced Bayer or Bayer, decided to take a stab in the lab to produce something fab. Now, to his credit, English chemist Charles Romley Alder Wright did the heavy lifting for this research back in 1874, but Bayer would be the one to bring it across the finish line as a medical product. Using morphine itself, German chemist and Bayer employee Felix Hoffmann worked his chemical magic, acetylating the morphine compound into diacetyl morphine. Remember acetylation, that'll be important in a bit. So what does all of that mumbo jumbo jargon mean? Well, I'll tell you. You see these two acetyl groups right here? They allow for better lipid solubility, meaning that this stuff is able to be absorbed into your bloodstream more quickly than regular morphine, allowing it to take effect that much faster. Early experiments boasted phenomenal results, with patients praising its intense effects. Thus, Felix dubbed his creation heroish, German for heroic or strong. But in 1898, Bayer would sell the wonder drug under a slightly different name, heroin. The product was advertised as a safer, non-addictive alternative to morphine, with the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal explicitly stating the quote, absence of danger of acquiring the habit. Well, ain't that just a big bulging ballsack of irony? I say that because morphine was originally introduced to the consumer market under the same premise. It was to be a safer, non-addictive alternative to opium. But instead of actually being safer alternatives, the subsequent products were just more and more potent forms of the same drug with heavier addictive qualities. Crazy, right? So now in the market, the Big H was sold in many forms: tablets, lozenges, elixirs, and of course, syrups. In addition to general pain relief, this syrup was claimed to be a suitable treatment for tuberculosis and pneumonia, which were very common at the time. It was even touted towards children as an effective cough and cold remedy, giving relief to not only sick kids, but their exhausted parents too. Well, he's not coughing anymore, is he? So for years, Bayer was producing and distributing these products worldwide, creating the next generation of addicts. But what Bayer scientists failed to realize was that the human body was actually breaking down the supposed medicine back into its original form. Remember acetylation? Well, through biological deacetylation, the heroin molecules were just being metabolized back into morphine molecules. So in truth, patients were just getting more powerful, faster acting morphine disguised as medicine. As for the innocent consumers, their quality of life was drastically altered from the supposed cure. What? While short-term effects seemed promising, mainly that addictive euphoric feeling, the long-term effects were horrifying. Doctors who prescribed stronger versions of the product reported an overwhelming number of requests to up their dosages, a clear-cut sign of tolerance and addiction. Even if the initial affliction had passed, consumers still demanded their doses. Those unable to be prescribed any additional amounts experienced terrible withdrawal symptoms. These included restlessness, bone and muscle pain, insomnia, nausea, and chills. In the extreme cases, heavy use of the stuff often resulted in complete respiratory failure, which of course means full system shutdown. Due to severe backlash, Bayer put a cap on all heroin production in 1913. Coincidentally, right before a little thing called the Harrison Narcotics Act was passed into law the following year. This effectively removed any and all diacetylmorphine-based remedies from the shelves, restricting them to only being available via prescription from a licensed medical doctor. It remained prescribable for a bit, but was ultimately banned in 1924. It took until 1970 to be officially recognized as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act, determined to have no acceptable medical use, regardless of the initial claims, upon release. Mental illness has always been a problem throughout human history, with our knowledge around the subject still evolving to this day. Although research on the topic dates all the way back to ancient times, it wasn't until the mid to late 1800s when things really started to rev up. But like any field of research, the preliminary phase is where all of the majority of the errors are made. You gotta fail a lot to learn from mistakes. Unfortunately though, some mistakes aren't initially recognized as such. Take one Dr. Manfred Sackel. A simple accident on his part was misconstrued as a success, and many inadvertently paid the price for it. Trained as a psychiatrist at the University of Vienna in Austria, you know, the place that isn't Australia, Dr. Sackel skipped across the pond to the US in the late 1920s to tackle the psychological disorder of substance addiction. You know, like morphine addiction. But instead of just prescribing a simple syrup, Dr. Sackel instead used insulin injections. The insulin was used as a metabolic sedative, basically calmed down the achy and shaky addicts, making them super sleepy instead. Much more manageable, but not exactly cured. They'll just get shaky again later. Well, unfortunately, Dr. Sackel must have drunk a tall ice-cold glass of dumb bitch juice one morning, because he accidentally pumped too much insulin into a patient, forcing them to go lights out, induced into a hypoglycemic coma.
Shoot! Don't go dying on me!
He managed to bring the patient back to consciousness through a delicate jab of glucose. But what happened next was actually astonishing. The patient, normally all fidgety and whatnot, showed no visible withdrawal symptoms and even improved mental clarity. It appeared that simply turning the brain off and on again gave the patient a much needed mental reset. Well, one success means it works, said no good doctor ever. With this supposed breakthrough, Dr. Sackle had written up his discovery and decided to go for gold. Now standardizing the process, he tested his new treatment, dubbed insulin shock therapy, on patients with schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder which, at the time, had no treatments whatsoever. Under insulin shock therapy, patients were put through rigorous coma induction and wake cycles. This occurred 5 to 6 times a week, with each coma lasting about an hour before regaining consciousness. This process lasted for multiple weeks, with patients being subjected to as many as 60 comas over the course of a few months. Some worst cases even lasted more than a year. Patients, when they actually had a light on upstairs, often experienced excessive perspiration, salivation, and agitation, with many also experiencing violent convulsions. Despite these very obvious adverse effects, Dr. Sackle published his findings, claiming that up to 70% of patients had full remission, completely cured of their medical condition. This jump-started the craze for doctors to start jump-starting their schizophrenic patients. But the repetitious hypoglycemic comas did little to benefit the body. Long-term effects from insulin shock therapy included severe memory loss, reduced attention span, and slower brain activity. These people had much more difficulty learning or even thinking. On the extreme end, of course, were the deaths. According to institutional clinical data from across the United States, mortality rates from the treatment reached as high as 5% in some facilities. Sure, that doesn't sound like much on paper, but when thousands and thousands of patients were having their brains forcibly rebooted, the numbers add up. Hundreds of unnecessary deaths thanks to shoddy research. Insulin shock therapy continued to be practiced up until the 1950s, where it eventually fell out of favor once antipsychotic medications entered the market. These medications were cheaper and safer for the patient. By the 1960s, the therapy was completely abandoned. As for Dr. Manfred Sackle, his heart abandoned him in 1957 when he died of heart failure at the age of 57. This delicious looking rock is called calomel, and it's responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths throughout human history. Although a simple compound, calomel, also known as mercurous chloride, was widely used as a treatment for centuries, with Arabian alchemists first documenting its use back in the medieval times to treat syphilis. But Swiss physician and double chin enthusiast Paracelsus pushed the research further in the 1500s. He noted the compound's astounding ability to rid the human body of black bile. Made you vomit and shit yourself. You see, for millennia, the prevailing medical theory was that of the Hippocratic Four Humors. I know I've discussed this before, but as a refresher, the theory suggested that the human body contains 4 main fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you're healthy, it means that all 4 of these fluids were in equilibrium. But even if one was just slightly off, it could cause you to get sick, so you had to bring things back into balance. You had to let out some blood, cough up a green glob, or learn how to drain your dragon, each a valid method for getting things back in order. Although Paracelsus could see a potential benefit with calomel's purgative properties, he actually advised against it, recommending it only as a last resort. This was because, from what he observed, the risks far outweighed the potential rewards. Even by the 16th century, the problematic nature of mercury as a treatment was already well known. Pure mercury had been used medicinally since the days of old, and the smarter science people had documented its less than desirable effects on the human body. Hair loss, tooth loss, fatigue, dementia, and death were all on the menu from heavy mercury usage, with death most likely being the worst one. But who needs warnings and research when you can make them dollar bills, y'all? Jump forward tens of decades into the 18th and 19th centuries, and American and English physicians were handing out calomel like caramels. Refined calomel is a tasteless, odorless white powder, which makes it a perfect oral medication. It remained marketed as a purgative and a potential cure for diseases or conditions such as syphilis, gout, bronchitis, cholera, constipation, or even ingrown toenails. But wouldn't you know it, calomel as a medical treatment wasn't the best idea. The violent bodily expulsions led patients to suffer severe dehydration. Not only that, but some patients were prescribed bloodletting sessions alongside their mercurial cure. So in an attempt to balance their humors, some patients way overcorrected to the point of dangerously low levels of bodily fluids. This resulted in the little shriveled up raisins to suffer what is called hypovolemic shock, meaning that their bodies couldn't provide enough healthy blood to their organs, leading to rapid heart rate, extreme weakness, and complete organ failure. But to some of the most brilliant medical minds at the time, this simply meant that the treatment was working. Scottish fellow William Cullen, a leading medical authority in the 18th century, saw these symptoms simply as, quote, nervous energy leaving the body, which, according to his logic, would eventually lead to a cure of the underlying disease. Any death that had occurred was not the fault of the calomel, but the disease itself. Regardless of his positive thoughts on the matter, he still cautioned excessive use of calomel and only recommended minimal effective doses. After all, like any substance, it is the dose that makes the poison. Well, one Scottish physician wasn't going to discourage the brave heart of this Scottish physician, Benjamin Rush. Not only a successful and world-renowned physician and philosopher at the time, Benny Rush also signed the American Declaration of Independence, so technically, he's a founding father. But that, of course, doesn't absolve him of his mistakes, and there were many. Take, for instance, the use of calomel to treat yellow fever in the 1790s. He took Cullen's recommendation for minimum doses and painted it with one of his own four humors, cranking everything into maximum overdrive. Benjamin Rush instead overprescribed calomel in, quote, heroic doses, combined with excessive bloodletting to put patients through what he called depletion therapy. Can't have any bad fluids in your body if you have none at all. His treatments, if you could even call them that, are estimated to have resulted in thousands and thousands of unnecessary deaths throughout the 18th century. But aside from egotistical doctors, calomel still remained in the medical spotlight. Luckily, its fate would be sealed in the 20th century, just at a terrible cost. Instead of being prescribed outright on its own, calomel began to be used as an ingredient for several consumer products that put himself into the forefront of modern psychosurgery. He theorized that mental illness was simply the result of abnormal neural connections in the frontal lobe of the human brain, basically the human equivalent of poor cable management. He developed this theory by researching other works in the field. For example, physiologists John Fulton and Carlisle Jacobson ripped out the frontal lobes of an aggressive chimpanzee, making it much more docile and agreeable, albeit a bit more drooly. Neurologist Richard Brickner noted the complete personality shift of a man whose frontal lobe was surgically removed following the discovery of a tumor. Alongside other evidence, Moniz made his case and was granted permission to test his theory. He took 20 depression and anxiety, had most of this elevated crew status from peeved to pissed, and Halsey was voted out of office, which is something the Pirates did. If they felt like the guy in charge just wasn't up to snuff, they could just vote him out democratically, or metallically, depending on the crew. Halsey was metaphorically stripped of his captain duties, and the crew took it upon themselves to attack the Dutch ship, expecting it to be some pushover merchant equipped with nothing more than a single-shot pistol and a few "why I oughtas." Not legally cleared to do so, Morgan began attacking Spanish strongholds between the years of 1667 and 1671. His exploits netted him millions in Spanish bribes to spare towns and cities, and by the time he attacked Panama City in 1671, Morgan had over 30 ships at his command and hundreds of crew members, by far the largest across the Spanish Main at the time. Now, in order to take down this Panama City where the gold coins gleam and the girls got titties, Morgan sent a well-armed and well-trained party of 300 men which clashed against roughly 1,600 inexperienced Spanish soldiers. And to say that the Spanish got their shit slapped would be an understatement. The Spanish forces saw between 400 to 500 casualties, with Morgan only losing 15 men. Panama's governor, now cornered, decided that instead of allowing Morgan to take the city, he would instead burn it to the ground. After Morgan claimed his victory, the city erupted in flame as the surviving Spanish troops set fire to the city. The blaze lasted until the next day, where Morgan and his crew plundered